This is the third and final section of our financial statements lecture. We're going to cover all these ratios, which again are ways to make the financial statements readable and understandable. We've got quite a few ratios to get through, so we'll probably have to break this up into multiple lectures, multiple 15-minute segments, but we'll see how far we get. We'll start with the liquidity ratios. Liquidity ratios measure how easy it is for a firm to meet their short-term obligations, and they're important because most firms that fail because they didn't maintain enough liquidity. In fact, it's the most common problem with small firms. Lots of small firms fail because they don't maintain enough reserve assets. They go to the bank and they raise a bunch of money and they spend it all on their business, inventory and setting up their fixed assets, and they don't maintain enough in reserve. So this is going to give you a way to manage to make sure you always have enough in reserve to weather, even if you have a downturn in your business, you can keep your doors open and not go bankrupt. So we'll start with what's called the current ratio. I'm going to switch over here to my dry erase board. The current ratio, the formula for it is current assets over current liabilities. So it tells you for every $1 of liabilities you're going to have come due in the next year, how many assets you have to cover those. We're going to use, for this lecture, Coca-Cola's balance sheet and income statement for their last quarter. Again, this is what we used in the last lecture. This is the same information you have on your assignment for this week. So this will show you how I came up with the ratios that I gave to you for Coke, and then you have to do the same for Pepsi. But if we look at current assets for them, it's $29,712. Current liabilities are down here, it's $27,008. I'm going to write these up on the board real quick. $29,712 divided by $27,008. And then if you divide those two numbers, numerator divided by denominator, you get 1.10, which means for every $1 of liability that's going to come due next year, they have $1.10 to pay that off. That's actually pretty low. If you look at most firms, it's on the order of 3 to 5, even up to 10. Coca-Cola can get away with having a relatively low current ratio because they have extremely high cash flow. So they don't need to have current assets set aside to meet their current liabilities. They make enough money in their business to do that. Most businesses don't have that luxury. Your current ratio is your reserve in case you don't make money. And most firms are going to have years where they have to weather bad economic conditions where they're not making any money and they need their current assets to meet those liabilities. So I would suggest if you start your own business, don't keep a $1.10 per current liability. Keep on the order of 5, maybe 3 if you want to be a little bit risky. Right, next is the quick ratio. The quick ratio, also sometimes called the acid test ratio, is similar to the current ratio, but it accounts for the fact that inventory is not always easily liquidated. When companies get into trouble and they are in bad economic conditions, usually they can't sell their inventory. That's because it's a bad economic condition, and that's precisely when we care about liquidity ratios. So what we do with the quick ratio is we take out inventory from current assets under the assumption that if they needed to really pay their short-term liabilities, they might not have their inventory available to sell off because nobody's buying their stuff at that moment. So over on my dry erase board, I've written out the formula. Quick ratio equals current assets minus inventory over current liabilities. We're going to go over to Coca-Cola and see that their inventory was $3,447. And now I've written the current assets, the inventory, and the current liabilities. So if you subtract that out, you get a lower number. The quick ratio is only 0.97. So So they actually only have 97 cents on the dollar to pay off every dollar of liability when you take out inventory. With Coca-Cola, it's not as big a deal because their inventory is probably going to get sold. But if you're a restaurant or you're a retailer or something like that, most small businesses, not taking out inventory can skew your number wrong. Okay. All right, so now let's move on to the asset management ratios. The asset management ratios tell us how well we are generating sales off our assets. So if we're investing our assets correctly, we should be generating lots of sales. Now, different types of businesses generate more sales per asset, but if you take similar businesses or the same business over time, you can follow these ratios to see how well they are doing generating sales. So inventory turnover ratio is the first one. Here I've written the formula. It's sales over inventory. So it tells you how much sales you're generating per dollar of inventory. If we go to Coca-Cola, their sales were $49,360. Their inventory was $3,447. So I have written these numbers up here, and if you divide the two, you'll get an inventory turnover of 14.32. You'd obviously like this to be higher. The higher this is, the more sales you're generating per your investment in your inventory. Days sales outstanding has to do with how well you're investing in your accounts receivable. Accounts receivable we don't think of as an investment all the time, but it is. It's an asset. It's under current assets. And you'd like to know what kind of return you're getting by allowing your customers to not pay today but to pay in the future. So here on the dry erase board, I've written out the formula for days sales outstanding. It's accounts receivable divided by daily sales. That'll tell you how many days it takes for your average accounts receivable to get paid off, which is the same as saying accounts receivable divided by sales divided by 365. Sales divided by 365 is daily sales. So let's go over to Coca-Cola. And they have accounts receivable 5,083 and sales of 49,360. So I've written these numbers out now on the board. And if you do that math, you come up with 37.49. One way to think of this number is it's the average credit terms they're giving their customers. Obviously, when you buy a can of Coke, you don't pay it on credit. You might put it on your credit card, but that doesn't affect Coca-Cola. When you buy a Coke, you immediately pay for it. But Coca-Cola is a wholesaler, so they sell in bulk to suppliers, and they obviously sell on credit to their suppliers, and they give on average credit terms of you have to pay us back in 37 and a half days. So this gives you an idea of what kind of credit terms you're giving, which gives you an idea of whether or not that accounts receivable asset is worth it or not. Okay, the next two ratios, fixed asset turnover and total asset turnover, those are just sales divided by total assets or fixed assets. I'm just going to do the total asset turnover ratio. So if you look at the formula, asset turnover equals sales over assets. So we did inventory turnover. This is basically the same thing, but instead of putting inventory in the denominator, we're putting assets or fixed assets. You can use only fixed assets if you want. Let's just do this one because it can be sometimes difficult to pick out just the fixed assets from balance sheets. But anyways, if you work for the company, it's not hard, but the company doesn't necessarily report all the details of what's a fixed asset and what's not a fixed asset. So we'll just do the basic asset turnover, sales over regular assets. So we'll go to Coca-Cola. We know sales, 49,360. Their total assets are 86,654. So I've written these numbers out here, and if you divide those out, you get 0.57. Obviously, you'd like this number to be higher. It means you're utilizing all your assets well. Inventory is your biggest true moneymaker as a company. That's why we started with inventory turnover. But you'd also like to make sure that you're using all your assets well. What will happen is, let's say you keep too many liquid assets, so you have too much cash. Your asset turnover will get hurt, but your inventory turnover won't. But that'll tell you that we're not keeping the balance, the portfolio of all our assets correct. We're wasting assets somewhere. So you want to look at both inventory turnover and asset turnover to see we're utilizing all our assets well. Alright, next we'll get into the debt management ratios. The debt management ratios tell us how much leverage we have. So how risky are we? The more debt you use, debt has to be paid back. If you don't pay your debt back, you go bankrupt. Equity doesn't have to be paid back, so you never have technically. I mean, if you're an equity holder, you'd like to make money, but it's technically by law you don't have to pay anything to the equity holders. You have to pay your debt back because you borrowed that money. So the debt management ratios are a way to look at, have we taken on too much debt? Or on the other flip side, you'd like to have, the more debt you take on, the higher return you get. So you'd like to strike a balance between the amount of debt you have. Later in the semester, at the very end of the class, we're going to talk about all these decisions and how do we decide how much debt to have and stuff. But here we're just looking at what's the metric we have to figure out how much debt we have. So I've written the formula out for the first one, the debt ratio. It's kind of the most general one. The debt ratio is total liabilities over assets, the percentage of your assets that you raised by borrowing. So if we go over to Coca-Cola, their total liabilities were 53,444. Their total assets are 86,544. So I've written these numbers out on the dry erase board. 53,444 divided by 86,654. That comes out to 0.617 or 61.7%, which means about 62% of the company is funded by borrowed money. We actually already saw this number. We've already seen some of these numbers because we did the common size statements earlier. So some of them are redundant, but that's what it is. So next we'll look at times interest earned. Times interest earned is a more direct measure of can we meet our interest payments. Here's the formula. Times interest earned equals operating income, which is how much you had right before you paid interest, basically. So it's the amount of money you had to pay interest divided by interest. So if this gets close to 1, that means you almost barely have enough money to pay your interest payments. You'd like this obviously to be much higher than 1. That means you have plenty of money to pay your interest. So let's go look at Coca-Cola. Their operating income, which is just before interest, is 12,744. Their interest is 408. So when I transfer these numbers over, 12,744, 408, and you divide those two, you get 31.24. And that's a great number to have, obviously. That means your operating income would have to fall 31.24 times less its size before you couldn't meet your interest payments. Coca-Cola obviously is in a very good financial position. They're not going to go bankrupt anytime soon. Lots of other companies will have a much smaller number here. This last one under debt management, fixed charges, we're not going to do that one. Instead of using interest in the denominator, you use all the fixed charges that you have to pay. So that's interest, lease payments to keep your business running, anything you have to pay. Now most of the time you can't find that all in the financial statements. so we're not going to do that.